So we're now recording both audio and video, and recordings are posted at paradoxes.org, and they're also posted on YouTube. I don't know the exact URL for the YouTube. I'll try to prepare a slide that says that for next week. But yeah, it is posted in two places, paradoxes.org as well as on YouTube. And so with that, let me share, and all of you should be seeing the first slide of my keynote presentation. And it's just, I always start with this slide, shows you how you can contact us outside of this class. All of our scholars at Reasons to Believe maintain a Facebook and Twitter page where we keep you up to date with the latest new evidences for the Christian faith, but it's also a means by which you can ask questions, and we do our best to answer all the questions that are being posted. And if you're not aware, Reasons to Believe has a 24/7 YouTube channel. We're literally putting up videos, sometimes several per day. And you can subscribe to that and you'll be notified of these new videos that are available there. And by the way, the subscription is free. And this is a series we've been doing on human origins. We have a 400-page long book on human origins that Fuzz and I wrote, Who is Adam? You can get a free chapter of that book at reasons.org/fuzz. And incidentally, anyone can get a free chapter. So feel free to tell your friends about that. And you can also get a free chapter of Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, where I address the exceptionalism of human beings contrasted with the exceptionalism of the soulish animals, and how God designed those soulish animals to serve and please us and to teach us crucial lessons, spiritual lessons. And I've often cited this book as evidence for, we live in a time where we're seeing a growing number of humans that identify themselves as atheists, as agnostics, as nuns, where they have no religion. What we notice is it's in direct correlation with the percentage of the human population that's living in major metropolitan cities. And when you live in a major metropolitan city, you're cut off from contact with wild birds and wild mammals, the very creatures that God designed to teach us crucial spiritual lessons. And I address that at Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job. And again, you can get a free chapter at reasons.org/Ross. By the way, you can get free chapters of all the books we've released at Reasons to Believe just by going to reasons.org/ the last or first name of the author of the book. And I found out, several of you told me that you weren't able to get to this workshop. I found out I've been temporarily taken down. I think it's back up now, reasons.org/Human Origins Workshop 2020. There's a workshop we sponsored in January, an all-day workshop where we invited leading scholars on human origins across the theological spectrum, from atheists to theistic evolutionists to creationists like ourselves. And we spent the day dialoguing on the scientific evidence relative to human origins. That's a place where you can have an opportunity to see how well the Reasons to Believe human origins model stands up to a critique from people who strongly disagree with us. Well, last week we ended up with a detailed comparison, excuse me, between Neanderthals and human beings. And what you see here, and people said, hey, it wasn't quite to scale. So what I've done is I've recreated this slide where I put the Neanderthal skull on the left and the human skull on the right to the same spatial scale. So it gives you an idea precisely where the human skull is bigger in its features and where it is smaller in its features. And I didn't get to point this out last week, but I think one thing that's obvious when you look at this is the jaw structure of humans is quite different than the jaw structure of Neanderthals. Neanderthal has a wider jaw. It protrudes a lot more than humans. Evidently, they had much bigger teeth than what we humans have. You also notice that The face allows for powerful jaw muscles, which is not the case on the human skull. And I think one thing that really stands out, notice how big the nose and eye sockets are for Neanderthal compared to humans. Neanderthals obviously had a much bigger nose than we human beings. And that would have been crucial because they were living in relatively cold climate zones without the benefit of clothing. So it's very important that cold air be warmed as it enters into their nose, down the throat, and into their lungs. Whereas humans wearing clothing and having control over fire would be able to get by with a smaller nose. It's also possible that Neanderthal had a much better sense of smell than humans, a bigger nose. And it's possible, we don't know this for sure, it's possible that a larger percentage of his brain was devoted to supporting the nose. It is well known that a larger percentage of his brain was sustaining the eyes. And you say, why such big eyes? Well, all the remains we found for Neanderthals are in caves, 100% of it. And so and they were living at fairly high latitudes. So it's quite possible that they were basically adapted to live in a low light environment. And so having larger eyes would have allowed for a larger pupil, and therefore they may have had significantly better capability of eyesight under low light conditions. And that might explain the large eye sockets. You also notice that the eyes had a lot more protection than they do with humans. Notice the really heavy bone structure above the eyes. And as I mentioned last week, when we look at the Neanderthal remains, from 74 to 96% of Neanderthal specimens show evidence of severe physical trauma. And obviously eyes are crucial for the survival of any mammal. And so it's possible that our creator gave Neanderthal much better eye protection just because they were living under conditions where they were going to be subject to frequent physical trauma. So it's important that the eyes be well protected. And of course, you notice that the cranial capacity is quite different. The humans, you actually see a lot more of the brain is up at the front and it's higher than it is for the Neanderthal. That accommodates, as I mentioned last week, a very large parietal lobe, and it's that lobe which enables us to engage in mathematics, philosophy, advanced art, complex language expression, and on down the line. Neanderthals are much more muscular than we are, and so it's, again, more of their brain would have been devoted to controlling those powerful muscles that they had. And the brain size for Neanderthals and humans is about the same. You say it doesn't look like that in these two images. Well, you're only seeing the front part. Neanderthals had a much more elongated skull. So the skull of humans is kind of a globular. For Neanderthal, it's elongated, similar to what you see, say, for the chimpanzees. And so, yes, for the males, the brain size of a Neanderthal is about the same as it was for a human. However, because Neanderthals were so much more muscular and heavier than we are, the encephalization quotient for the Neanderthal is considerably less than it is for the human. That's the ratio of the mass of the brain to the total mass of the body. And that's a factor that does come in to determining the intellectual capability of the specimen. What is the encephalization quotient? Explains why, for example, certain birds display a lot of intelligence. In fact, it's well known that certain bird species show a degree of intellectual capability considerably superior to anything you see in the non-human apes on planet Earth today. Well, let me move on to the next slide. I showed this slide last week. Basically shows you the geographical extent of Neanderthals. These are all the places where Neanderthal specimens have been found. And most of them are in Western Europe, France, Spain, Italy, Romania, Crimea, even Southern England. And I got a question last week, how could they have made it into Southern England? Well, Neanderthals were on the earth between about 250,000 years ago and about 45 to 50,000 years ago. And most of that time, there was no English Channel. The sea levels always are lower during an ice age. And so Neanderthals are predominantly on the face of the earth during an ice age. And during an ice age, you got a land bridge that joins France to England. But as I mentioned last week, the extent you see here is strong evidence that Neanderthals were not wearing clothes, because given their physical morphology, and if you didn't get all the details, again, you get in the recording of last week's message, excuse me, where I went into that in quite a bit of detail. Their bodies are designed to handle a certain narrow temperature range, and this geographical extent fits what you'd expect from the morphology of the bodies of Neanderthals, if indeed they were not wearing clothes. And as I'll describe in a few minutes, we have no evidence that they had clothing making technology. You see the orange zone, that's where we found some Neanderthal specimens in Syria and Israel and southern Turkey. And then there's two different sets where they overlap the Denisovans. There's a debate today whether the Denisovans are a separate species from Neanderthals. They may be one and the same. We simply don't have enough evidence yet to show that they're distinct species, but the Denisovans that have been labeled exist in Western Siberia. That little green zone you see there in Uzbekistan, and then the purple zone basically on the edge of Kazakhstan. And so that kind of gives you the range. And I mentioned this briefly, about 6 weeks ago, and there's a huge debate going on in the scientific literature about whether or not Neanderthals had any musical capability. And this is the one and only item that's been produced from archaeological remains where they were claiming that Neanderthals had musical capability. This is a so-called Neanderthal flute. And one thing I think is relevant in terms of trying to understand the technology of the Neanderthals is that given the mitochondrial DNA evidence we have and the food supply data, excuse me, it's well established in the scientific literature now that the total population of Neanderthals probably never exceeded a few thousand, probably hovered between 1,000 and 9,000. There's one paper claims it may have gotten as high as 23,000, but only very briefly. So for most of the time, we're talking only a few thousand individuals spread out over a few million square miles, which means that these Neanderthals were in very small groups, and they were really stressed trying to come up with food. And I think this factors into a lot of modern day anthropologists trying to claim that Neanderthals had sophisticated technology and were involved in art and music. Given what we now know about how scarce their food supply was, what their technology was for hunting, and the mitochondrial DNA evidence is especially persuasive that their population level never was very high. It also explains why they experienced such a rapid extinction event between 45 and 50,000 years ago, given that their population was that tiny. But it also means that given the stress they're under, they simply wouldn't have had time, no matter what their intellectual capabilities were, to do anything as sophisticated as coming up with something like a modern flute. So what this is a femur of an animal, of a large animal that could have been hunted by Neanderthal, and it's got two holes. Although when you read the papers that are trying to claim this a musical instrument, they actually claim that the U-shaped groove you see at the end on the left and on the left were holes 3 and 4. But I think as you look at this image, you can tell that's a real stretch. If you're trying to claim that that little indentation at the edge on the left is another hole, to place your fingers. It certainly doesn't look like the two holes we see here. And as a number of other researchers have pointed out, the fact that we see clearly only two holes and that both holes have about the same diameter. And what they note too is that the distance between the two holes is consistent with some big predator with large incisor teeth puncturing the bone to get the marrow out of the bone. And if you ever watched predators, they really want to get the marrow that's inside the bone because that's where they get a lot of nutritious, and it's also very high fat. And so they're eager to do that. And so they would often use their incisors to puncture the bone. Bottom line is, even after 30 years of publications, there are more papers disputing the claim that this is evidence that Neanderthals are making musical instruments than papers claiming that they were. And this is something that's addressed in detail by Sue Dykes. She's the physical anthropologist that was actually on her way to join our staff at Reasons to Believe when she had a sudden heart attack on the flight to our headquarters and actually died in JFK Airport. But before she passed away, she finished the 5 chapters for her book on evolution. And one of those chapters talks about all these papers that are published that try to claim that Neanderthals were just as sophisticated and technologically capable and intellectually capable as we human beings. The same authors are trying to claim that Neanderthals are fully human. And this is where I would suggest you go back to the recordings of the past 2 weeks, particularly last week where we talked about the morphological differences. Those morphological differences are so radical, and the DNA differences are so radical, the idea that they're human like we are, at least in my opinion, is completely untenable. But you can look at the recording where I actually go through not all, but most of the morphological differences between humans and Neanderthals. And as my colleague Fazal Rana pointed out, they simply don't have the right brain lobes to be able to support the development of this kind of technology. And so I would argue that probably the best way to interpret these papers is that this is a piece of a femur from a large animal that was hunted by a large predator, saber-toothed tiger or some kind of hyena or whatever. And these holes were punctured by that. This is not a musical instrument. So anyway, that's the debate, but it's consistent with a very low population of the Neanderthals and the stress they had for food supply. Literally, Neanderthal really only had time and energy to come up with enough food to survive. And so it's unlike what we see with humans, where we find ways to come up with a surplus of food, a significant surplus, and then set apart a large fraction of our population to engage in art, music, technological development, and evidently that was not possible for the Neanderthals, and for what it's worth, they simply lacked the dexterity, the hand dexterity, and the brain capacity to be able to support this. So 3 weeks ago, I had Fuz Rana on with me, and we talked about the recent claim that Neanderthals were weaving thread, but it was Fazal Rana who made the point that what we now know about the brain structure of Neanderthals and their hand structure is they wouldn't have had the dexterity to do the kind of complex weaving that we humans do, the kind of weaving that would be necessary, for example, to weave clothing. Humans are able to do that, but not Neanderthals. As we pointed out, certain birds have that capacity, but none of the great apes on the planet today have that capacity. I wanted to show you, before we move on, some of the other Neanderthal artifacts, and these are the ones that are the most advanced. And incidentally, that flute that I showed you there, or femur bone that was punctured by a large predator, it's also quite possible that that is related to a human find. So it's not yet settled whether this is a result of some large animal predator, whether associated with Neanderthal or with humans. But these particular artifacts, everyone I know of agrees that these were produced by Neanderthals. not by humans, but by Neanderthals. And just to make it clear, we also see some limited tool making capability on behalf of the great apes that share the planet with us today. So for example, we see chimpanzees able to carve tools and use them for gaining food that they otherwise couldn't get. But these are some of the most sophisticated Neanderthal tools found to date. And you can see on the right that they were able to get things like obsidian and very hard minerals to come up with something that had a sharp edge or a sharp point. And they could use that for scraping meat off of bones, and also for sharpening sticks that they could use as spears. And what we see on the right is something they could use to actually pound and make puncture. But what we notice consistently with Neanderthals, we do not see them combining stone with wood, with sinew, to make complex tools like bow and arrows, hammers, shovels, axes. What we see is that they are capable of using a single piece of wood to come up with a spear, in the same fashion that chimpanzees actually manufacture spears to hunt bush babies. We see that the Neanderthals and Denisovans were doing the same thing. But yeah, we don't see them combining a piece of wood with some shaped stone like this and using sinews to make, say, an axe. And we certainly don't see them doing anything as sophisticated as a bow and arrow. Whereas with humans, that kind of technology shows up almost immediately. Some of the most sophisticated tools are the following. So we have evidence that Neanderthals were actually gathering up shells. These are all seashells, and we do have evidence that Neanderthals actually were living in caves near seashores, and so they would have been able to collect seashells. And with seashells, it's easy to break off pieces, and as you know, seashells have sharp edges, and so there's lots of evidence that Neanderthals were using these broken pieces of seashells, again, to scrape meat and fat off of bones of animals they killed and be able to consume much more of the animal. Quite different what we see from other predators where they actually leave a lot of food behind. We notice with Neanderthals, they really didn't leave much behind at all. So they were using tools like this to be able to enhance the amount of calories and nutrition they can get from the animals they hunted. We think there's some evidence that Neanderthals were gatherers, that they were actually picking fruit, eating fruit, and maybe some vegetables. That is still disputed. There are papers published making the point that it's quite possible, even probable, that Neanderthals were getting virtually all of their food from the killing, the hunting of large birds and large mammals. And so, again, this would factor into why they apparently have a low lifespan and why there has to be why we see such a high rate of severe trauma, severe physical trauma, particularly if they're hunting the larger animals. There would have been incidents where the large animal got the better of them, and that would explain some of the trauma they faced or the fact that they were running so hard at these animals that they were tripping and injuring themselves. As I mentioned last week, one of the major differences between Neanderthals and humans is the design of the muscles, is that Neanderthals are much more muscular than we are. But when you look at the kind of muscles they had, their muscles were designed for high bursts of energy expenditure. Whereas when we look at humans, we're designed for endurance. And so Neanderthals, even though they were much heavier than us, very likely could run a lot faster than we could, but they couldn't run as long as we could. And so when humans come on the scene, they develop a brand new hunting strategy, which is basically to run their prey to a point of heat exhaustion and then kill them. And so you get a band of humans they just keep the prey running, even though they couldn't run as fast as the prey. They just kept them running and running and running to a point that they suffer from heat exhaustion. Unlike Neanderthals, humans were hunting in the heat of the day. As I mentioned last week, another unique feature of the human anatomy is we have a wonderful perspiration system, and so we're able to keep our bodies cool when it's hot. Neanderthals couldn't do that. They were designed for a colder climate. But again, these seashells that we see here are evidence that their diet most likely was predominantly, if not totally, from the flesh of large birds and mammals that they had hunted. And their morphology would have given them the capacity to be able to have these short bursts of speed where they could trap the animals and kill them. But also, when you're hunting, where you're doing these high exertion bursts for short periods of time, you have a higher probability of suffering a traumatic injury. And so that's consistent with the fact that we see in the remains of Neanderthals such a very high percentage of traumatic injury. So with that, let me see if we can finish our little series here on Neanderthal, the claims for Neanderthal technology. And so you do see this in the scientific literature, papers published by physical anthropologists where they're claiming that Neanderthals were highly advanced creatures. If not fully human, the most advanced technologically and intellectually speaking of all the non-human bipedal primates. And again, I commend to you the chapter in our book. It's going to be released in the fall in Evolution. I recommend you read all 5 chapters by Sue Dykes on human origins, but especially the ones where she addresses the diversity of these papers on where they address whether or not Neanderthals had sophisticated technology. The Neanderthal flute we've already addressed. The control of fire. There's no doubt in the scientific literature that Neanderthals were using fire for their benefit. There is huge debate about whether they had control of fire. As I've read the papers, and Sue Dykes goes into more detail than I can right now, all we see is evidence that they were taking advantage opportunistically of fires that were already started, either wildfires, and some people think they were taking advantage of fires that were started by humans, and so they may have visited the sites that humans had after the humans left and took advantage of the fire there. But just like what we see with chimpanzees today, when chimpanzees see a wildfire, they gather up all these nuts that they're not able to break open with their primitive tools, and they throw the nuts on the wildfire. Then they run away from the wildfire, wait for the wildfire to burn out, then they go back and they have all these roasted nuts that they're able to easily open and consume the food that's inside. And there are papers establishing that Neanderthals were doing the same kind of thing. But we see no evidence that they were building a hearth or doing anything like the humans were doing at that time, which was actually collecting grains, grinding the grains, roasting the grains, and using hearths to bake different bakery products. We see no evidence that Neanderthals had that kind of capability. A lot of papers have been published claiming that Neanderthals were burying their dead, and in burying the dead, were having funeral services, and therefore these authors are trying to claim that however we Christians define spiritual capability, Neanderthals had it to the same level that we do. But the evidence they cite is where you see a partial skeleton of a buried Neanderthal adjacent to flower pollen. And when you say adjacent, we're talking like 20 feet away. And so they're trying to claim that these Neanderthals were burying their dead, and then they were throwing flowers on top of the burial site. And this is evidence that they were having a funeral service akin to what we do today. And indeed, that's what we do today, is that, we bury our dead, and we have a practice, at least here in America, that we throw flowers on top of the coffin as it's put into the ground. However, the fact that it's 20 feet away means that that could be there coincidentally. It may have nothing to do with Neanderthal activity. And moreover, I think it's a stretch to say throwing flowers on top of a dead body is somehow an expression of something spiritual. Because after all, when a matriarch elephant dies, the surviving members of the herd will actually spend an entire day marching around the dead matriarch, heaping straw and other vegetation on top of that dead matriarch until that dead matriarch is completely covered. And so this would be, I would argue, the evidence we see for the Neanderthal barrier is no more sophisticated than that. And it's really expression of the emotions, not the spirit. I mean, when a bird or a mammal, when they have a mate that dies, a mate that they've been bonded to all their life, they express grief over the loss of their mate. That's an expression of the emotions, not necessarily an expression of the spirit. And so what's going on in these papers, according to Sue Dykes, and I agree with her, is anthropomorphization. We're basically reading into it how we would interpret data if it happened to one of us. But we're basically imposing things upon these creatures that they really do not have. In terms of the advanced tools, we do see some level of advancement at the very end of Neanderthal existence. But again, no evidence that they were able to use things like a shovel or an axe or a bow and arrow. What we do see is that their ability to carve stones seems a little more sophisticated than it was a few thousand years earlier. And so people are claiming that they actually were showing some advance in technology, but it's a relatively trivial advance. I mean, it's all based on a couple of stones where we see that they've been manufactured to a little degree, but it's still just a shaped stone, a stone that was chipped off of another stone and struck a few times to try to get it into a better shape. And Neanderthals were capable of doing that throughout the entire time they were on the face of the earth. And so again, Sue Dykes, and I agree with her, is saying we really have no undisputed evidence that they demonstrate any kind of advancement in technology. Other papers have been published where they're saying, you know, that stone that has that extra shape to it is really not a Neanderthal stone at all. It's something that a human did, and the Neanderthals stole it from the human. As I mentioned last week, the great apes that share the planet with us today, they love to steal stuff from us. I've been in parts of the world, both in Africa and in Japan, where I've encountered these monkeys. And they hang around, and if you leave anything behind, they're going to grab it. So they're pickpockets. They'll take it right out of your pocket. They'll take it right off of your table. So if you got, let's say, a plate on top of your china, on the top of your table, they'll grab it and take it. So I mentioned last week, I ran into a group of about 200 Japanese Macs. One time when I was in Japan, and every one of them was holding an empty Coke can. They love to steal stuff, but they really have no idea how to use it. And then recently, there's been a lot of debate about the use of symbols. And let me see how we're doing here on time. Okay, I got a couple more slides. I'm going to have to wrap this up next week, but I'll very quickly give you an update. We're going to talk. There's a huge debate going on whether Neanderthals had symbolic capability. And what I'm going to do is review the papers supporting symbolic capability and contrast them with other papers that have been published about certain non-human animals displaying the same kind of symbolic capability, and basically whether or not we see scratches on a piece of stone, linear scratches, as evidence for symbolic capability. But there's also been plenty of papers published making the point that only humans have the capability of symbolic, able to actually come up with new symbols and be able to manipulate those symbols for a specific purpose. One thing I will say is the authors are trying to claim that Neanderthals were using symbols. None of them are claiming that they were able to manipulate these symbols. They all agree that's unique to us as human beings. They also agree that even if it existed, we certainly see no advance in symbolic capability. Whereas with humans, we see that in big in very dramatic ways. And one thing we mentioned last week, there are papers published that claims that Neanderthals were capable of sophisticated language expression. But as we mentioned last week, we now have anatomical evidence that they lacked the jaw structure, and particularly the larynx structure and the larynx organs, and the brain capability to be able to support language, any kind of sophisticated language. Yes, they could make sounds, but what we see in their anatomy is they would not be capable of a wider range of sounds than we see in modern apes today. Whereas with humans, we're immediately capable of coming up with a language that is vocabulary sizes in the tens of thousands, in the case of English, in the millions of words. Okay, I'll end there. I was hoping to finish this week, but we'll wrap it up next week, and maybe even be able to launch into our new set of talks. So let me exit this, and we'll take the rest of the time for questions. And as always, I'll take questions on any subject, not necessarily we've been talking about here, but again, we're going to talk about what we have. I'm up for that too. So I'm going to have Mark moderate the questions.
All right, Hugh, we're ready for the first question, which comes from Eric. And Eric says, William Lane Craig posted a link last night that he claimed vindicates the Lorentzian rather than the Einstein's special theory of relativity. Can you comment on this? Is he overstating things? Now, he put a link there, but we obviously can't get onto the link and read the article.
Well, this is something that Bill and I have been talking about literally for at least 25 years, if not 30 years. So this is not new for Bill, where he's been skeptical of both special and general relativity. And, the times I've had to talk with him, I've been trying to explain that, the experimental evidence in support of special and general relativity is very high. He's countered that you can explain some of that experimental evidence through the Lorentz approach, but not all. And it's something I've published in my book, The Creator and the Cosmos, 4th edition, where I give the latest evidence in support of both special and the general relativity. And what I've been trying to explain to Bill is that, number one, the space-time concepts you see in special and general relativity do not challenge the space-time concepts that Augustine pulled from Scripture. And that's his main concern. His main concern is not scientific, but theological. He says, when I read what Einstein said about space and time, it seems to contradict what Augustine has written about space and time. So one conversation I had with Bill, I was making the point, you need to take into account that there's 15 centuries between the writings of Augustine and the writings of Albert Einstein. And, language changes over the years. And the way that Augustine defines space and time is not the same as the way physicists in the 20th and 21st century define space and time. And if you take into account how the dictionary's definitions have changed over the 15 centuries, I personally see no difference whatsoever between what Augustine was saying about space and time and what Einstein was saying about space and time. But when it comes to the scientific evidence, you really have an overwhelming case that special and general relativity, the way Einstein formulated, is indeed correct. And literally every year we're coming with more sophisticated tests of both special and general relativity, not just in terms of greater accuracy, but in terms of greater application. In the case of special relativity, the confirmation is now beyond the 21st place of the decimal. There's very few things in physics that we can prove are correct to more than 20 places of the decimal. Special relativity is one of those. And general relativity isn't that far behind. We have some tests that are good to 14 places of the decimal, proving that general relativity is a correct theory. And so I've been trying to encourage Bill, stop trying to go against this, especially when there's no theological need to go against such a powerful scientific evidence. And yes, a lot of what Lorentz said is true. A lot of it is very consistent with special and general relativity. And that may be where the confusion lies. I've not looked at the paper well, maybe I have, but I'll have to go to that link to see if it's anything I've not seen yet. But that's where it stands right now.
Great, thank you. Stephen Posta has a question from Spring, Texas. He asks, the Bible teaches us about two of God's creations, the angelic realm and our four-dimensional universe. Obviously, God is under no obligation to reveal any other creations that he might have crafted. What is Reasons to Believe's viewpoint on the possibility of other creations?
Well, he is correct. The Bible tells us about the angelic realm. It tells us about the universe in which we're constrained. And then we have God dwelling in realm. I mean, God is not confined to the realms he creates. So he could transcend both the angelic realm and the realm we've created. And then the Bible also speaks about heaven and hell. Those could be distinct realms. And there may be other realms that God has not told us about. That's all possible. And I find it interesting that in Revelation 21, it does speak about nations that clearly don't apply to us. And so that leaves the door open that God is creating, will create other creatures and maybe have them dwelling in realms distinct from ours. These are all speculations. We don't know. But we do know that we humans live in one creation right now, and those who are redeemed by the work of Jesus Christ have been promised they'll enter a new creation. We also know that heaven and hell are entirely distinct from the universe, because when God speaks the universe out of existence, both heaven and hell survive. So they are not part of the dimensional realm of the physical universe. And if he's got a follow-up, I'm more than happy to take a follow-up.
Okay, well, we don't have one yet, but we do have a question from, looks like Tony Sapavina from Georgia. What are your thoughts regarding near-death experiences from those who claimed to see lost loved ones, Jesus and heaven, versus others who say we are only in a sleep before the resurrection? Is one take more accurate, or can both be possible?
Well, there's a lot of debate on that by Christian scholars. And I always tell people, go to John's first epistle, 1 John chapters 3 and 4. He commands us to test the spirits to see where they're from. And I've been in ministry long enough to have heard literally hundreds of stories from people who claim to have had a near-death experience. And many of those, I would guess the majority of those, are really not a near-death experience. It's basically individual having some kind of a dream or vision where they think they've had some encounter with life beyond this life. There's a percentage of them that I believe are satanically induced by Satan or the demons. So there's some kind of demonic connection. And if you leave open doors to the occult, that gives permission for the demons to invade your life and literally fill your mind with things that didn't really come from you. It came from them. And then I believe there are real experiences where God permits them to have a glimpse of what's happening beyond the grave. And so I'm not saying all near-death experiences have nothing to do with God in heaven. I think some do, because I've actually had people report to me their encounters that are very consistent with the Bible teaches, and based on their experience, I have no reason to doubt that they had that kind of encounter. And years ago, we interviewed a Dr. Saban. He's a medical doctor who's written extensively on near-death experiences. And we interviewed him because we thought he's one of the more credible people who've scientifically investigated this phenomena. And what he did is he limited his research to out-of-body experiences where people that he was operating on would later recover, and said that during the operation, they left their body and could actually look down on their body. And so after a while, he got so many of these stories, he said, I'm going to do an experiment. And what he did is he put a message on a girder above the operating table, on top of the girder. And the only way you'd be able to know what that message was if you had actually been above the girder looking down on the message. And what he shared with us is that he did have some patients who claimed that they had an out-of-body experience during the operation. They had a vision of heaven. And he said, well, can you tell me if this indeed is the case? What was the message written on the girder? And they were able to come up with that message 100% accurate, what was there on the girder. So he's presented some of the best evidence I've seen that yes, there really are instances where people have a near-death experience. They leave their body and actually have these encounters, what they see in heaven. And frequently what you see with the ones where people have had this near-death experience is they're given instructions. Typically, they're greeted by all the dead in Christ that they've known during their life, and they're there to congratulate them, making the point that when we who are followers of Jesus Christ pass from this life to the next life, it's like crossing the finish line of a race. And when you cross that finish line, everyone who knows you rushes towards you and congratulates you on a race well run. And people I've known who've talked about this, they said they all say this is what happens to them, is that they see these people that they knew in this life that have passed on that are believers, and they're there just waiting to greet them and to congratulate them. And then they get a message that they need to return. And almost always it's a message that God has some other ministry for them to complete before they finish this life. Basically telling them, look, your race is not over. There's one more thing or a couple more things that I want you to do in your life here on earth, and they return. So those are legitimate ones, but I've seen far more that are illegitimate, where people are basically, and so I come to the question of asking them, what kinds of occult practices they've been involved in, because I hear stories that tells me this sure sounds like a demonic deception. And then there are many more stories yet where it's simply people pulling this out of their own mind, basically to get attention. And sad to say, there's been a lot of books written by Christians that, in my opinion, fall in that category, where they claim to have a near-death experience, they write a book about it. The books sell in the hundreds of thousands, some cases the millions, but then later it's revealed that this is something that they thought they experienced. It wasn't a real experience, or it's something that they simply concocted. So those kinds of things happen. That's why John tells us, test the spirits. Where I see some of the strongest evidences for life beyond the grave, and the source for this comes from Gary Habermas. He's probably the world's leading expert on the resurrection. If you ever want to see a first-class debate in the resurrection, just look at the videos where Gary Habermas debates unbelievers on the resurrection. But one of the things he's devoted a lot of study to are these very short visions that Christians experience when a loved one passes away. And typically it's when a loved one passes away that died before they had a long life. So they're literally dying fairly early in life. And then it usually happens when the surviving Christians have some level of doubt about whether the one that had just passed away really did give their life to Christ and is in heaven. And what Gary was sharing with me is that what happens 35% of the time when a Christian dies, and especially when a Christian dies a little bit before their time, 35% of the time, the surviving Christians get a vision within the next 72 hours. And the vision, he says, is always between 6 and 7 seconds long, a very short vision. But it's basically a vision where they see their dead loved one, and they see their dead loved one in a beautiful place, and the dead loved one is reassuring them, don't worry about me, I'm in heaven, I'm doing fine, and they wave goodbye and it's gone. And when Gary was sharing that with me, it brought back an experience I had. My older son was in a violent incident where a friend of his was stabbed to death, In fact, my own son was stabbed 4 times at the event trying to rescue his friend from these 3 violent attackers. And I was with him in the hospital. My son survived, his friend did not. And I can tell you, my son barely survived, but he did. And finally, they took all the tubes out and he could talk. And the first thing he said is, where's Ryan? And we had to tell him Ryan did not make it. And so he felt very sad about that because he says, you know, I took all those stab wounds by thinking at least I saved my friend. Well, it didn't happen. The very next day, I was with him in the hospital by his bedside, and I saw my son's eyes open wide. And then he said to me, Dad, do you believe in visions? I said, well, son, tell me what you saw. And he relayed this vision of seeing his friend Ryan. And he said, in the most beautiful forest I could ever imagine. He was waving goodbye to me and telling me not to worry about him. And my son was worried about him because he had a drinking habit. But when I talked to that young man when he was in our home, he says, you know, my father is the pastor of a mega church. I'm getting a degree. And as soon as I finish my degree, I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to become a pastor. But, you know, until that time, he was basically sowing wild oats. He was, you know, visiting bars, and he was a very gregarious person. But I frankly didn't have any doubts that he was serious about his walk with Christ. But a lot of young men, they said, let me dabble in this first. But my son had his doubts, but then he had that reassurance. And interestingly, his vision was about 6 seconds long. 6 months later, I was talking to the pastor, and he told me a story about how he had a vision. It was the identical vision. So I asked him for the date and time. It was the same date, the same time that my son had the identical vision. So to me, that's powerful. And I shared that with Gary Habermas. And he says, yes, I hear a lot of stories just like that. So that's off topic, but that's some of what I believe is very powerful evidence, independent of the Bible, that there really is life after death. Eternity is written on our hearts. And when we die, it's not over. We will continue to live. Any being that God creates as a spirit being, whether it be a human or an angel, will live forever. It's simply a matter of choosing where you want to spend eternity. God's not going to force you to go to heaven, but if you want to go to heaven, that's where you're going to go, and that's where you can live with him for the rest of eternity. If you want nothing to do with God, God's got a place where he will not bother you in the least. But we all get to live for eternity. There is no blackness after death.
Thank you, Hugh. We have another question from Mark Durham from the Los Angeles, California area. And he asks, in chapter 15 of your book, Weathering Climate Change, you speak of beauty and human comprehension of it. How do evolutionists explain our affinity for beauty?
Well, they struggle with that because they're aware that that seems to be unique to us human beings. You really don't see the non-human animals basking in beauty. They just seem to ignore the beauty around them. And they seem to have no capability of being able to discern something that's beautiful from something that's not beautiful. It's like they don't even care. But we humans obviously care a lot about beauty. And so that's a major challenge to an atheistic worldview. How come we humans are able to recognize beauty, and why do we seek it out? And why do we express it in our music, in our art, our clothing? I mean, we see compelled to seek after beauty and to express it to the greatest degree possible. And that's referred to as the beauty principle. And what I find interesting, I ran into a theologian, famous theologian, Thomas Torrance. He's passed away. But he told me just about how many scientists he had led to Christ just through a short message he had developed on this pervasive beauty we see in God's creation, and how we humans are the only part of this creation, the universe, where we're able to appreciate that beauty. I'm actually going to be writing some articles on that, and I put some of that in my book, Weathering Climate Change, basically making the point that when you look at the past 4.56 billion years of Earth history, we humans are living at the most beautiful time, scenically speaking, in Earth's history. Our planet has never had the expanse of beauty that it has in the last 10,000 years. We're literally living at the most beautiful time in the history of the Earth. And I argue that that's no accident, that God created us to appreciate and enjoy beauty and made sure he put us here on Earth at the most beautiful time. It's also a time when our planet Earth has had the greatest diversity of species. Never before in the Earth's history have we had so many species of life on planet Earth. And you look at all these different species, it's like God is basically being extravagant and expressing beauty in all these creatures. A few weeks ago, I put a post on my Facebook page about a question I get from a lot of unbelievers. If there's a God, why did he create so many species of beetles? I mean, there's 500,000 species of beetles on the planet. Why so many? But I showed a figure that shows just a few hundred of those beetles. And what you discover is, yes, there's all these different species of beetles. When you look at them, they're beautiful. Just some of the gorgeous colors and the different patterns you see in these beetles, that can't be explained by evolution. It's really an expression of a God who enjoys creating great diversity and great beauty. So even the insects of the world are beautiful. I look at stars. Stars are beautiful. I find it interesting that my colleagues who are not believers, when they look at these spiral galaxies, they call them grand design galaxies. You actually see these features of beautiful design, even in the spiral structure of galaxies. Mathematics. I mean, the mathematics that describes our physical universe betrays incredible elegance and beauty. Now, I've been talking about this on my Twitter page. A number of atheists have been pushing back on that and saying, well, you call it elegance, I call it garbage. Who's to say that it's elegant, or who's to say that it's ugly? It's all in the eyes of the beholder. But it's interesting, maybe a few atheists see the math as ugly, but the vast majority of mathematicians and physicists see it as incredible elegance. And it's like they can't think of a way of actually framing their equations in a more beautiful and elegant way. And the very fact that we come up with terms like beauty and elegance tells us that it's not just some figment of our imagination. There's something more to it than that. Now, if there's a follow-up, I'm happy to deal with a follow-up.
No, we have another question from Juven from Holland. And it's actually two questions embedded. The first one is, if Neanderthals and hominids would cause such a stir for creationism through Darwinian evolution, why would God create such beings?
That's a very good question. It's a question we address both in our book, Who is Adam, and in my book, Navigating Genesis. And interestingly, the source of our answer comes from Ian Tattersall, one of the world's top physical anthropologists and a committed atheist, but he's very friendly when he's talking to us. And he was the one that said, you know, when we look at all these bipedal primates that preceded human beings, there's a very interesting pattern. Number one, we have no evidence for any of them existing in Australia, North America, or South America. I found one disputed paper that claims there may have been some in the Alaskan region of North America. That was a time when there was a wide land bridge joining Siberia to Alaska. That's the only paper I've seen. And I was not convinced, but was in that paper. And to me, that's kind of Asiatic anyway. And what he was pointing out, Ian Tattersall, is that Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, is where we have the greatest number of species finds for these bipedal primates. And then next would be Asia, and then third would be Europe. But we don't see any undisputed in North America and nothing in South America or Australia. But he says what we notice is that when humans began to spread out from the one region into all the places of the world, When they moved into North America and South America and Australia, they wiped out so many large bird and mammal species that they were not able to get beyond the Stone Age, and they were not able to develop a large population. They literally wiped out the very species of bird and mammals that they needed to launch and sustain civilization and a large population. And he was pointing out to us that when humans entered Australia, they quickly wiped out 94% of all the large-bodied bird and mammal species that existed there, including the animals that were crucial for being able to launch civilization. Animals like cows that could pull plows, camels, horses, these creatures were wiped out. Same thing happened in North and South America. The animals that remained the longest were the mastodons, but they were wiped out. And the bottom line is these big animals that are so useful for launching agricultural activity are also easy sources of food. I mean, if you kill a mastodon, you can feed a family of 4,000 for a few weeks, one kill, and you can take it easy. So, and mastodons did remain until about 3,000 years ago in North America. But what he pointed out is in sub-Saharan Africa, when humans arrived there, the extinction rate was only 4.5%. And likewise, when you look at Asia and Europe, the extinction rates were all in the area of about 10, at most 30%. And so civilization was able to be launched and accelerated and thrived in Africa, Europe, and Asia, but not in North and South America and in Australia. And as Ian had pointed out, this actually seems to fit your model at Reasons to Believe. If there's a God behind all of this, he would know that we humans are such skillful predators and that we would be in danger of wiping out the very animals we needed to launch and sustain civilization. And of course, from our biblical perspective, we'd also add that humans fell in the Garden of Eden. They rebelled against God. They became selfish. God commanded us, manage the resources of the planet for your benefit and the benefit of all life. But because we rebelled against God, we became selfish, and all we thought about was our benefit, not the benefit of the rest of life. And we weren't even looking long term in terms of our benefit. It was all short term. That's what selfishness does. You take a short term perspective. And because of that, God knew in advance, of course, that we would sin, and this would be a problem for us. And so he created a sequence of these bipedal primates, basically to train large-bodied bird and mammal species. When you see large animals on two legs with weapons in their hands, run. Keep in mind, I mentioned this in my book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job. God designed birds and mammals to relate to us humans, to serve and please us humans, and to come to us for that relationship. So the natural tendency of these wild birds and mammals is to come to us and relate to us. Now, we see examples of that when Europeans began to settle in North America. They ran into these passenger pigeons, and passenger pigeons had a very strong affinity for human beings, such a strong affinity that when humans were hunting them, they would not fly away. They literally flew towards the hunters and wound up being wiped out. And in the space of a few decades, the passenger pigeons were driven to total extinction. To me, that's grievous, because just think, if we had saved the passenger pigeon, we'd have this wonderful bird species that really loved hanging around us and serving and pleasing us. That's gone. And it's because they were not trained to avoid predators on two legs with weapons in their hands. And likewise, we came close to doing the same thing with the whales, because whales are another species that have a very strong affinity for human beings. And so we noticed in the whaling days, the whales had come towards the whaling ships rather than running away from them. But in Africa, Asia, and Europe, the terrestrial animals there, over the space of several million years, were trained by these bipedal primates. Run away when you see tall bipedals with weapons in their hands, and therefore they survived in sufficient numbers that they could be domesticated by humans and be able to use by humans to launch and sustain agriculture and advance civilization. Whereas that didn't happen in North and South America and Australia until Europeans brought them the animals that they had wiped out. And incidentally, I don't think we covered this in our series, is that when you look at the bipedal primates that preceded humans, you do not see a linear progression of bipedal capability. The bipedal capability does not evolve linearly towards what we humans express. It literally goes up and down dramatically. It's chaotic. Same thing with cranial capacity, the brain capacity. The brains get bigger, they get smaller, they get bigger, they get smaller. And so there's no linear progression. The most recent bipedal primate, namely the Homo florensis, actually has a brain that's the same size as a chimpanzee, only a quarter the size of the human brain, and their bipedal capability was only slightly more advanced than we see in chimpanzees. Where we do see a linear progression is in the capacity with respect to time to these creatures to be able to hunt large-bodied bird and mammal species. So in this sense, I can see a purpose for God creating these species. And I'm frankly convinced that they're not the product of evolution, they're a product of special creation based on papers that have been published in the scientific literature where they examine mammal species that have relatively low populations, and that would have applied to all the bipedal primates. What they notice is they go extinct long before they experience any kind of significant evolutionary change. And that happens for every terrestrial mammal with a body size, an adult body mass that exceeds 3 kilograms. And all the bipedal primates are way beyond adult body masses of 3 kilograms. So just like humans were specially created, I argue based on this evidence that likewise, the 10 to 12 different species of bipedal primates were specially created, not the product of naturalistic evolution.
So the follow-up question that he has is, why does God have a masculine gender, in particular referred to as the father? He has a ex-Muslim friend who argues that God should be transgender. You even disagreed, but couldn't give an apologetic reason.
Well, the Bible refers to God as Father, basically to make the point that God is a protector. He has authority. I mean, that's typically how the cultures of the world determine look at human fathers. They're the ones that provide for their families. They protect their families. They exercise authority over their families. And God's basically referring to himself as Father, basically making the point, just like your earthly fathers take on these roles, I take on the same roles, only I do it with perfect love. Your earthly fathers are always messing up and trying to do those things, but I don't mess up. And keep in mind, God the Father does not have a body. So to think of him as having masculine features like we do. And so I think that's important to make the point, is that God's in a totally different category than we human beings. And therefore, when he assigns a masculine pronoun to himself, we shouldn't think of it in exactly the same way we do with human beings. It's different. And so I think it's a mistake to try to read in. A lot of people think, well, the Holy Spirit is feminine. That's a mistake too. The Holy Spirit does not have a body. The only member of the Godhead that has a body is God the Son, Jesus Christ. So I think we got to be careful about these gender assignments. And after all, we see these are basically ways of God trying to communicate his attributes. And so when he refers to himself as Father, I think we shouldn't take it beyond the fact, hey, he is the perfect provider. He provides for everything. He's the perfect lover. He is love. We get our love from him. And his love never fails, and his love is always constant. There's no ulterior motives. I mean, there's lots of scripture that basically explains far beyond the mere assignment of a gender what the attributes of God are. So I don't run into debates on that. I just simply encourage people, why don't you go through the entire Bible and simply try to figure out all the different attributes of God? You can do that easily within a few weeks. Do a little Bible study on the attributes of God. Over 100 different attributes are described in the Old and New Testament, more in the Old than there is in the New. And I think that helps resolve all this controversy over God and gender assignment.
Thank you. We have some follow-up questions from Doug McComb, the street preacher from Monrovia, California. It seems to me, I remember you referring to what we hypothetically called exotic particles. These are said to have a, quote, negative mass. What exactly is a negative mass? And would such exotic particles not violate the known laws of physics?
Well, there have been papers published about particles having negative mass. These are speculative papers. There's nothing in the physics literature that actually establishes or particles with negative mass. And incidentally, if you had a significant part of the universe filled with such particles, physical life would be impossible. So the very fact that we're here indicates at a minimum, if there are particles of negative mass, they don't add up too much, and they consist of a very, very tiny fraction of the total particles. When we do talk about exotic particles, that's referring to dark matter composed of particles that do not interact with protons, neutrons, and electrons, or ordinary matter, and do not interact with photons, don't interact well with light, or either they interact very weakly. A good example of one of those particles would be neutrinos. Neutrinos interact very weakly with ordinary matter and with photons. So for example, there are quadrillions of neutrinos that penetrate the Earth every day, every minute. Most of them go right through the Earth and don't interact with anything at all and come out the other side. They go through our bodies all the time and nothing ever happens. Occasionally they do interact, so we do have neutrino observatories in different parts of the Earth, but we have to put those neutrino observatories deep underground because you get a far stronger signal from cosmic rays than you do from these neutrinos. But occasionally neutrinos will interact with ordinary matter or photons and we get to see them. So neutrinos have been detected, but physicists are also persuaded that they're more likely to be exotic matter particles that don't interact with ordinary matter or with photons at all, and which means the only way you're going to detect them is if they decay from one exotic matter particle into another exotic matter particle. And if they decay into an exotic matter particle that weakly interacts, then we can show that they exist. And so a number of astronomers and physicists are on a quest to find exotic matter particles beyond just the neutrinos, the 3 different neutrinos that have been discovered. Most of the theories believe that there's an extremely low mass particle, the axion. 38 different exotic dark matter particles have been suggested as possibly existing, where their different attributes based on a particle creation model have been speculated. And there's actually some serious attempts to try to detect these axions. There's been papers published where they said, we think we're on the way to detecting an axion. The closest I've seen is a paper published on a white dwarf binary star, where they're seeing this white dwarf cooling at a rate that's beyond the normal cooling, and therefore they're concluding that there are axions in that white dwarf star that are decaying. That explains the additional cooling that we're seeing. And what they published was about a 3.5 standard deviation detection of this axion. But the standard in particle physics and astrophysics is we cannot claim it to be a real detection until the signal for the detection is at least 5 standard deviations away from the noise. In this particular case, it was 3.5. So it's a hint, but that's all it is a hint. And right now there's a study going on where they're looking at dozens. I think it's going to take a study looking at least 100 white dwarf binary stars before we get enough signal that we can say we found the axions or we've not found the axions in this case. Large Hadron Collider is also trying to find axions, but the closest I've seen is a study of white dwarf binary stars.
Hugh Doug has a couple of follow-ups. One of them is, do particles like this negative mass particle even exist? And what does the term negative mass specifically refer to? And he questions whether this is antimatter. And if it is, how's antimatter created?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. The papers that he's talking about, or the articles he's talking about, may simply be referring to antimatter, not particles with negative mass. So antiparticles are particles that are just like the real particles. So for example, we have electrons, we have anti-electrons. They both have the same mass, but we call them antiparticles because when an electron gets close enough to an anti-electron, they annihilate one another where there's no mass left at all. And the annihilation is basically converted into energy, and it's converted into energy according to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. And so when antimatter and matter get together, there's a production of a huge amount of energy. And it also works the other way. You can take all that energy and create a particle and an antiparticle. We do see antiparticles. We've seen them in different astrophysical observations. We also see them in particle accelerators. However, the amount of particles in the universe far outnumbers the number of antiparticles. And where you do see antiparticles, they don't last long because sooner or later, very quickly, they come into contact with a real particle and you get an annihilation event and a burst of energy.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Steve. Revelation 22:2 reads of the tree of life. It yields fruit every month and has leaves for the healing of nations. Is this the same tree of life as in Genesis 3? And if so, is this tree to be eaten continuously, not one bite like the tree of good of knowledge of good and evil? Can we conclude two related things? And the two related things he's asking whether we conclude is, number one, that Romans 5:12 claim that death passed upon all men due to sin is a young earth basis for no death prior to sin.
Yeah, good questions. You got that one sentence in Revelation 22. And so people speculate, is that the same tree that was in the garden? Could be. Doesn't have to be, but it could be the same tree. Do you need to continuously eat of it? Well, notice that the tree in the Garden of Eden, once Adam and Eve had sinned, God blocked access to the tree of life because he says if these humans eat of that tree, they will live forever, meaning they will live forever physically. So that indicates that all it would take would be the consumption just one time of that tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and you would live forever. So you wouldn't have to go back again and again and again. One time would do it. Now, what we see in Revelation 22 may be a different kind of tree of life where the nations need to visit that tree on an ongoing basis. The text isn't explicit enough to say whether one-time eating will do it or whether we have to go back again and again. However, I'm persuaded that those nations are not referring to redeemed human beings because we're going to inherit a new body. It's going to be an incorruptible body, a body not subject to decay or death, which means we'll have no need to access the tree of life. The eternal body that we're going to receive once we pass from this life to the next life is a body that has no need to take of the tree of life. And Revelation does not specify what those nations are, but I believe, just as it says that we redeemed humans will be ruling over the angels will also be ruling over the nations. And evidently those nations are going to need access to the tree of life. Why, I don't know, because it tells us in new creation, there will be no thermodynamics, there'll be no gravity, there'll be no electromagnetism, but it doesn't tell us what new physics there will be. So that's one of the mysteries that's there in the Bible. I'm eager to find out, once my life is done here, what's really going on with that tree of life in Revelation 22, and what these nations are really all about, and how are we going to be ruling over them and teaching them.
Thank you, Hugh. Stephen Posta from Spring, Texas asks, knowing of all the biblical promises for what a glorious environment awaits the followers of Jesus in the next life, why do we resist dying? Emotionally and physically, man seems to struggle to release his spirit consciousness from this realm. Is this fully explained as natural instinct, or is it something else?
Well, I think God built within us a self-preservation. And we see that with all the animals that God created. It's in the plants too, for that matter, that we see within the DNA of plants and animals this self-preservation software. And so all of us are motivated to do what we can to extend our life here on earth. And yes, we look at all the rewards of of what exists beyond this life. I mean, Paul writes about it in his epistles and says, given what glorious future we have to look forward to, it's like, wouldn't we all want to die right away and get there? I mean, crossing that finish line, entering heaven, it's just, life is so much better in the afterlife for the Christian. Why remain here? But Paul answers that and basically makes the point. We are here on earth to complete a mission. And so he uses the analogy of a race. Just like someone who's running a race doesn't stop 2/3 before the finish line, he strives to finish that. And I like the race analogy, because if you're running a race for all you're worth, you're going to cross that finish line completely exhausted. And so that's what Paul says. I'm running the race of life with every bit of energy and spirit and wisdom that's within me, because I want to finish well. And so God, I think, placed within us this self-preservation software, basically to ensure that we stay fixed on the mission we have here in this life, in spite of the fact of the glory we have to look forward to in the next life. And so, yes, as a Christian, I'm in a hurry to get to the next life because it's so much better what I'm experiencing right here now. But I realize I'm here because I've got a mission, and my mission is not yet finished. And, you know, I've also noticed this with believers, I think ties into this. I've had people I know who are believers, and they're facing a serious health challenge, a challenge that threatens their life. And what they tell me is, I've been expecting and looking forward to heaven, but right now I have this sense of fear. As a Christian, why do I have this sense of fear, given what I have to look forward to and given my confidence in it? And my response to my friends when in that situation is, because it's not your time. Uh, you're not going to die from this malady. You're going to recover. And I mean, if you were going to die, given your walk with the Lord, he'd be filling you with his peace and reassurance. And you'd be looking forward to Jesus giving you a personal escort from this life to the next life. And but the fact that you have this sense of fear tells me it's not your time. And indeed, when I've had those experiences, my friends have always recovered and have continued on in their ministry for the Lord. And that's something we see in Psalm 23, that when our time comes, uh, he will be with us. His rod and his staff will comfort us. There's certain comfort. We'll be guided across that threshold, and God himself will take him across the threshold. And, one of the pastors at the Christ Church Sierra Madre, where I've served for a number of decades, he's now retired, but Richard Anderson was pastor there for, a good 40 years. And he loved to spend time with people who are on their deathbeds and really minister to them. And what he shared with me is just how frequently, hundreds of times, he had been with believers who were totally verbal and conscious when they passed from this life to the next life. And he says every time what they would tell me was, I have to say goodbye. He's calling me by name. It's my time. And indeed, Jesus would call them by name and take them across that threshold. It says they didn't fear death. They were welcoming death. They realized that their role here on earth was done, and now they get to look forward to a glorious reward. And so, again, death for the Christian is like an awards ceremony. We cross from this life to this next life. We're going to be congratulated. We're all going to receive our rewards in proportion to the mission we fulfilled here on earth. That's what Paul points out. We're here for a reason and a purpose, and there will be rewards, but they're going to be handed out in proportion to the degree to which we fulfilled the mission that God assigned us here on earth. And therefore, that gives us all the more motivation to stay here until our mission is done. So that to me, I think explains why, just like all the other animals on the face of the earth, we have this strong drive to preserve a life here on earth in spite of the fact that we have a much superior future to look forward to.
Thank you, Hugh. I think we're bumping up against the end of our recording time. So I'd like to remind everyone that if you post a question today and don't get an answer to it today, please come in next week. Remember that between 10:30 and 10:45, we have an open Q&A also, and you're welcome to propose your questions at that time. If you get a question that you posed today and it didn't get answered, make sure to tell us that this was something that wasn't answered last week, and we'll give you priority. So with that, Hugh, would you close us out?
I'll be happy to do that. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate your moderating this discussion. And Father in heaven, I thank you for the questions that were posed. Thank you too, Lord, that for the time you've placed us here on earth, a time when there's just so abundant revelation, deep understanding of what your Bible is communicating to us that people didn't have centuries ago, and especially, Lord, a deep and extensive and comprehensive understanding of what you revealed in the book of nature. Father, I pray that would strengthen the faith of each one of us. And Father, as our faith is strengthened, I pray that we be able to take this information, this understanding and wisdom and knowledge, and use it in a way to encourage others likewise to develop a relationship with the creator of the universe, to receive his offer of redemption and become part of the family of God. In Jesus' name, amen.